We often look up at the night sky, searching for the big, bright things. But what if the biggest cosmic secrets are hiding in some of the faintest objects out there?
That's a great point, and today we're diving into exactly that, these things called dwarf spheroidal galaxies.
Dwarf spheroidals. Okay, so tiny galaxies.
Yeah, essentially they're these small, incredibly dim companions orbiting huge galaxies like our own Milky Way and Andromeda too.
Hmm.
Think of them as mostly spherical clumps of really old stars.
Old stars. And you said dim.
Very dim. And they have hardly any gas or dust, which is interesting. It makes them different from, say, dwarf elliptical galaxies. And kind of a neat detail, they get named after the constellations we spot them in.
Ah, like Sculptor and Fornax. I think you read about those.
Exactly. Those are the first two properly identified way back in 1938 by Harlow Shapley. He saw there was something different.
And finding them must have been tough, being so faint.
Oh, incredibly. Even though Sculptor and Fornax pack the mass of maybe 10 million suns, their light is spread out, very low surface brightness. So yeah, finding more took a long time.
Right. And didn't this lack of discoveries cause a bit of a headache for cosmologists? Something about models predicting more?
It absolutely did. By the late 90s, our best cosmological model, we call the Lambda Cold Dark Matter model, or Lambda CDM, it was predicting, well, loads more small satellite galaxies or halos around big galaxies like the Milky Way than we'd actually found.
So the theory said many, but the observations said few.
Pretty much. It was this missing satellites problem, a real puzzle. It made people wonder, is the model wrong? Or is there something about galaxy formation we don't understand?
Okay, so a discrepancy. But then did we start finding more? Did our tools get better?
Exactly that. Things started changing around the year 2000. Big surveys like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, SDSS, started scanning huge patches of the sky much deeper than before.
Ah, SDSS, right.
Yeah, and they started picking up these ultra-faint dwarfs. They found maybe a dozen or so new ones. Then fast forward to around 2015, another big survey, the Dark Energy Survey, or DES, found a similar number again.
Okay, so the numbers started climbing, getting closer to what the models expected.
They helped, definitely. It eased the tension with the CDM model quite a bit, although the whole missing satellites thing is still debated, still something researchers are working on.
Never quite goes away, does it? Now, you mentioned these dwarf spheroidals, or dSphs, are different from dwarf ellipticals. What about globular clusters? They're also old collections of stars, right? How do they differ from dSphs?
That's a really crucial distinction. They can look superficially similar, old stars, often spherical shapes. But the big difference, the fundamental one, is dark matter.
Dark matter.
Yeah. Dwarf spheroidals seem to be absolutely dominated by dark matter. They have these huge, massive dark matter halos relative to the number of stars you actually see. Globular clusters, on the other hand, seem to have very little, if any, dark matter. It's almost all stars, ordinary matter.
Wow, okay. So DFs are mostly invisible stuff holding a few old stars together, while globular clusters are just the stars.
That's a good way to put it. And this dark matter dominance is a huge part of why DFs are so important for cosmology. They're like natural laboratories for studying dark matter.
Interesting. And because they're orbiting big galaxies like the Milky Way, our galaxy's gravity must affect them too.
Oh, absolutely. Their lives are shaped by their host galaxy. You look at DS like, say, Sextans or Hercules. Their structure, the way their stars move inside them, even their overall shape, can be stretched or distorted by the Milky Way's gravity. Tidal forces, we call them.
So they're constantly interacting, being pulled and shaped, which brings us back to why we study them so intensely. What are the big questions they help us answer?
There are quite a few, actually. First, they're relics of the early universe, potentially. Studying them tells us how the very first smallest galaxies might have formed. That's a direct test for our cosmological models, but on smaller scales than big galaxies.
Okay, testing the models. What else?
We can study how environment affects galaxy evolution. What does being a satellite, constantly bathed in the gravitational field, and maybe the hot gas of a giant galaxy, do to a small galaxy over billions of years? Does it strip away its gas? Does it trigger star formation? Or shut it down?
Right, nature versus nurture on a galactic scale.
Exactly. And they can even act as probes. Their orbits trace the gravitational potential of the Milky Way, especially its outer parts, helping us map the distribution of dark matter far out. They can even help us understand the Milky Way's own hot, diffuse, gaseous halo.
So tiny galaxies, but they punch way above their weight in terms of scientific
You
importance.
could say that, definitely.
And this importance was recognized early on, wasn't it? I remember reading that the Gaia mission, which we'll talk more about, actually had dSphs as a key target right from the start.
That's absolutely right. When Gaia was proposed back in 2000, believe it or not, we only knew of 8 classical dwarf satellites around the Milky Way. Just 8.
Only 8, yeah.
Yeah. But even then, the mission proposal highlighted them. It called them, and I think this is a direct quote, key dynamical tracers of the outer mass distribution of the Milky Way. The idea was they could probe the galaxy's gravity way further out than stars or globular clusters could.
So mapping the Milky Way's dark halo was a core goal using these dwarfs.
Precisely. And it wasn't just about their overall orbits. Gaia was also expected to revolutionize our understanding of what's happening inside the nearer dwarf galaxies.
How so?
Well, for dwarfs like Ursa Minor, which is relatively close, Gaia's precision was expected to be good enough to measure the motions of individual stars within the dwarf. This allows for detailed studies of their internal dynamics.
Like seeing how the stars are swirling around
Yeah,
inside.
exactly. And Ursa Minor was particularly interesting because there were some very tentative hints from earlier data that it might be rotating slightly, but around its minor axis, the short axis.
Rotating the wrong way, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. It's unusual. And that hint, even if marginal, could mean several things. Maybe the galaxy isn't perfectly spherical. Maybe it's triaxial. Or maybe it's being tidally pulled by the Milky Way in a funny way. Or perhaps something odd about its dark matter halo's shape or temperature.
Fascinating. So subtle motions could reveal big things about its structure or history, and Gaia could also help figure out which stars actually belong to the dwarf, right? And
That,
whether some are just streams.
yes, that was another key aspect. Distinguishing true member stars from foreground Milky Way stars or background galaxies is crucial. Gaia's proper motion measurements, how stars move across the sky, were expected to be the game changer.
And how does that work?
Well, stars belonging to the dwarf galaxy should all be moving together through space, sharing a common proper motion, separate from the random motions of foreground stars. Gaia could measure this tiny collective drift, and this would also help test the idea that some of these objects might not be stable, bound galaxies at all, but rather long, stretched-out tidal tails, remnants of something that got disrupted. Gaia's data could show if the stars formed a coherent bunch or a drawn-out stream.
Got it. So Gaia promised a huge leap. And that brings us to the actual results, specifically the work by Amina Helmi and her collaborators in 2018, using the second big data release from Gaia, DR2.
Indeed. That study was a landmark. They focused on 9 of the classical DFs, the brighter, better-known ones discovered earlier.
And how did they use the Gaia DR2 data to pick out the member stars?
They used a clever combination of Gaia's measurements. First, astrometry of the positions and motions. For stars near the known position of a dwarf, they looked for stars whose proper motions were very close, statistically speaking, to the average motion expected for that dwarf, usually within about 2 standard deviations, a common statistical cutoff.
So finding the stars moving as a group.
Right. And second, photometry, the colors and brightnesses. They selected stars that fell onto specific branches in a color magnitude diagram, like the red giant branch or the blue horizontal branch. These are characteristic locations for the old stellar populations that dominate these DSEs.
Okay, so filtering by motion and by the type of star, focusing on the old ones expected in these systems. Did this selection reveal anything interesting about how the stars are arranged?
It really did. Once they had these clean samples of member stars, just looking at their distribution on the sky reveals some fascinating details. For the Carina dwarf, for instance, the proper motion-selected members showed clear signs of S-shaped tidal tails, streams of stars being pulled off the galaxy by the Milky Way's gravity.
Like visible evidence of the gravitational tug-of-war.
Exactly. And for Fornax, another DSE, they saw asymmetries in the spatial distribution of the stars, suggesting it's also feeling the Milky Way's influence, perhaps being distorted. These weren't always obvious before cleaning the sample with proper motions.
It really sharpens the picture. Now, we keep saying these dwarfs are faint, but they're also really far away, aren't they? That must make measuring their motion incredibly difficult.
Oh, absolutely. They are very distant. The closest one in their sample, Sagittarius, is around 26 kiloparsecs away. A kiloparsec is about 3,260 light years, so what's that, roughly 85,000 light years?
Still pretty far.
Yeah, and that's the closest. Leo Ursus, one of the most distant classical dwarfs, is out at about 250 kiloparsecs. That's over 800,000 light years. way beyond the Magellanic Clouds.
Wow. And at those distances, their movement across our sky must be minuscule.
Infinitesimally small, almost. Their bolt-proper motions, the average motion of the whole galaxy, are typically less than half a milliarc second per year. It's like trying to see a hair's width move from several miles away. It requires unbelievable precision.
So before Gaia, how did astronomers even measure this?
With great difficulty. The best measurements often came from the Hubble Space Telescope. Hubble could get the needed precision, but only for a tiny field of view, often just the very center of the dwarf, and you usually needed multiple observations years apart.
Limited and time-consuming.
Right. Gaia DR2 was a revolution here. Helmy's team compared their Gaia proper motions with the best previous HST measurements, and while they generally agreed, the Gaia errors were significantly smaller.
Better precision.
Much better. Especially for dwarfs like Carina, Draco, and Fornax, where Gaia identified hundreds, sometimes thousands, of member stars across the entire galaxy, not just the core. This allows for a much more robust measurement of the average motion.
And it's all in one consistent reference frame, right?
Exactly, an absolute reference frame tied to distant quasars, which is critical for comparing the motions of different dwarfs and understanding their orbits around the Milky Way. And showcasing Gaia's power, they even got the first ever proper motion measurement for an ultra-faint dwarf called Boot Select.
First ever. For such a faint object, that's incredible.
It really highlights what Gaia could do, but perhaps the most exciting part was using these new precise positions and motions to figure out their orbits.
Tracing their paths through space. How did they do that?
They took the Gaia DR2 positions and the full 3D space velocities, using the proper motions and previously known line-of-sight velocities, and combined them with sophisticated models of the Milky Way's mass. These models include the central bulge, the stellar disks, and crucially, the extended dark matter halo.
So using our best guess of the Milky Way's gravity field.
Right. And then they essentially ran the clock backward computationally, integrating the orbits back in time for about 250 million years to see the paths these dwarfs have likely taken.
Cosmic archaeology, what did these orbits look like? Did they find any patterns?
Well, first, the Gaia DR2 data itself provided much improved distances, which are crucial for orbit calculations. Let me see. Fornax, around 147 kbc, Draco 79, Carina 106, Ursa Minor 76, Sextans 89, Leo Io way out at 254, Leo II 228, Sagittarius we mentioned at 26, Sculptor 87, Boots II 66 kpc. Well, just for comparison, the LMC is about 50, SMC 63 kpc. So these dSAs are generally further out than the Magellanic Clouds, except Sagittarius.
Okay, thanks for that context. So the orbits themselves.
One really striking result was how similar the orbits of Draco and Ursa Minor looked. They seem to be moving on very comparable paths.
Similar paths, could they be related somehow, like they fell in together?
That's certainly a strong possibility. It suggests they might share a common origin, perhaps being part of a group that fell into the Milky Way's gravitational pull together. It's a fascinating clue about how satellite systems are assembled.
Very cool. What about the others? Did they group up too?
Mostly, no. The orbital planes of the other dwarfs seemed quite distinct from each other and from the Dracorsa Minor pair. For example, the orbit of Sagittarius is almost perpendicular, orthogonal, to the Dracorsa Minor orbital plane.
So a mix of different paths. Any general trends, like do they orbit in the same direction as the Milky Way rotates?
There's a slight tendency for prograde orbits. Yes, moving in the same general direction as the Milky Way's disk rotation. Most of them do. But there are exceptions. Fornax, notably, is on a strongly retrograde orbit.
Going against the flow, like some globular clusters do.
Exactly like some globular clusters. However, when they looked at the shape of the orbits, the eccentricity.
How stretched out they are.
Right. They found something interesting. While some orbits are elongated, very few are highly eccentric. And some, like Carina, are even on relatively circular paths. This was a bit unexpected.
Why unexpected?
Because cosmological simulations, those lambda CDM simulations we mentioned, often predict that satellite galaxies falling into massive halos like the Milky Way's should arrive on very radial, highly eccentric orbits, like comets plunging towards the sun.
But that's not quite what Gaia is showing for these dwarfs.
Not really, no. The distribution of eccentricities they found doesn't quite match those simulation predictions. Carina's near-circular orbit is particularly puzzling if it just fell in recently.
So what are the big takeaways from analyzing these orbits?
Two main things stand out from the Helmy study. First, there seems to be only a weak connection, if any, between the orbits of these dwarf spheroidals and the orbits of globular clusters, despite the occasional similarity like Fornax's retrograde motion. This reinforces the idea that they are fundamentally different kinds of objects with different histories.
Okay, DSs and GCs are different beasts. What's the second point?
The second is that discrepancy with the simulations regarding orbital shapes, the eccentricities. It suggests that maybe the simulations are missing some physics, perhaps related to how gas dynamics or interactions affect infall, or maybe the satellites formed closer in than assumed. It's a point of tension, a challenge for the models.
So Gaia's data is really pushing the theorists. Now, what about the old idea that the Milky Way's satellites might all lie in some kind of vast plane? Did this study shed light on that?
Ah, yes, the plane of satellites debate. What Helmy and colleagues found was, well, it's complicated. They found that the orbits don't really define a single thin plane. Instead, the orbital poles, the direction perpendicular to the orbital plane, tend to cluster somewhat, suggesting the orbits are often oriented roughly perpendicular to the Milky Way's disk.
So orbiting more up and down relative to the galactic disk rather than in the disk.
Sort of, yes, on average, but with a lot of scatter. And importantly, even if the planes have similar orientations, the direction the dwarfs are moving within those planes could be very different.
Can you give an example?
Sure. They found Sculptor and Sagittarius are moving in orbital planes that are almost perpendicular to each other, and both of those planes are also nearly perpendicular to the Milky Way's disk.
Okay, so definitely not a simple, single rotating disk of satellites.
No, not like the planets orbiting the sun, it's more complex.
Yeah.
The researchers describe it as having an ordered complexity.
Ordered complexity. What does that imply about their origin?
It perhaps suggests they didn't all form from the breakup of one single object. The diversity in orbits argues against that, but the fact that there's some preferred orientation, maybe related to the Milky Way's own axis, hints that perhaps they fell in collectively along a preferred direction in space.
Like along a giant cosmic highway.
Exactly. Maybe a filament of the large-scale cosmic web, these vast structures that funnel matter together. If such a filament was roughly aligned with the Milky Way's spin axis, it could potentially explain why many orbits are somewhat perpendicular to the disk, even if their individual paths within that inflow varied.
Fascinating. So maybe group infall along a filament, but not all born together. A much richer, more complex picture than we had before.
Absolutely. It shows how these faint little galaxies are really powerful tools for reconstructing the assembly history of our own Milky Way and testing our fundamental understanding of cosmology.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. We've gone from the struggle to even find these dim dwarf spheroidals to understanding their crucial role in testing cosmology, and now seeing how Gaia is just transforming our view of their movements and history.
It really has. And the findings are genuinely surprising.
Yeah.
Their diverse orbits, the way they differ from globular clusters, the tension with some simulation predictions, it just underscores how much more there is to learn, even in our own galactic backyard.
Definitely. And it leaves us with a really interesting thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Given this ordered complexity in the dwarf galaxy orbits, what might that imply about the nature of the cosmic web filament that possibly guided them in? What was its structure, its dynamics? And thinking ahead, what other secrets are these faint galaxies holding back about how the Milky Way itself formed and grew and how it all fits into the grand cosmic tapestry? It's just amazing that these tiny, faint smudges hold such profound clues about the universe.